There were 5 of them when they were born. You would not have been able to tell them apart at first. 5 small shapes in a shallow hollow, each one barely the length of a thumb, pressed together in a fur-lined nest at the base of an old garden hedge, eyes sealed, ears flat. The kind of small that makes you hold your breath. But if you had looked closely, and I mean really looked, you would have noticed something. 4 of them were roughly the same. Same weight, same color, same restless, squirming energy even in sleep. And then there was one that was different. Smaller by a margin you could see without measuring. Lighter by a margin you could feel if you held it in your palm. Tucked at the outside edge of the huddle rather than the center, because the center had already been claimed by the 4 that were bigger and stronger and had arrived in the world with more to work with. The runt of the litter. That is the phrase most people reach for, and it is accurate as far as it goes. But what it does not capture is the specific reality of what that means for an animal that is already one of the most vulnerable creatures in a suburban yard. It does not capture what the coming days would look like for the smallest one, what it would cost, what it would have to do just to still be alive by the end of the week. Welcome back. Today we are going into the nest. Not the whole nest, just one small corner of it. Just the one that was left closest to the entrance when the others pushed toward the warmth. Stay until the end, because the question I want to leave you with is one that I think will stay with you longer than most things you will read today. Was the smallest bunny ever expected to survive at all? And does the answer to that change anything about what you think survival means? What the runt actually is? Before we follow the smallest bunny through what comes next, I want to spend a moment on what it actually is, because the word runt carries a weight of implication that is worth unpacking, and most of it is wrong. A runt is not a defective animal. It is not a mistake. It is not the result of something going wrong in the biology of the litter. What it is, in almost every case, is the outcome of a competition that began before birth, and that the smallest kit lost through no fault of its own. Uterine position, placental access, the distribution of nutrients across a litter of 5 in a body designed to support 3 or 4. These are the variables that determine which kits arrive in the world with the largest reserves, and which one arrives with the least. The smallest bunny did not choose its position. It simply occupied the one that was left. At birth, the difference between the smallest cottontail kit in a litter and the largest might be 2 or 3 grams. That is less than the weight of a paperclip. And yet, in the context of an animal that weighs 30 grams at birth in a healthy litter, 2 or 3 grams is the difference between a kit that can push its way to the center of the huddle and hold its position there, and a kit that cannot. It is the difference between nursing first and nursing last, between getting the highest calorie milk that comes at the beginning of a feeding and getting what remains after the larger siblings have finished. Every feeding widens the gap slightly. Not dramatically, not all at once, but by a fraction each time. The larger kits get more. They grow faster. They generate more body heat. They hold the center of the nest more firmly. And the smallest one, by no action of its own and through no cruelty of its mother, drifts incrementally toward the outside, toward the edge of the fur lining where the insulation thins, toward the entrance of the burrow where the cold air moves in at night, toward the margin. This is not neglect. The mother does not choose this. She nurses all of them when she visits, twice in a 24-hour period, once just after dark and once just before dawn. But she cannot control which kit reaches the milk supply first. She cannot redistribute warmth from the larger kits to the smallest one. She cannot reorder the huddle. She can only come and give what she has, and leave again before the darkness makes her presence a liability to the nest. What happens in the intervals between her visits, in the hours of cold and dark and hunger, is determined by the same forces that determined which kit was born smallest. Not cruelty, not choice, just physics. Just the math of a litter where the resources do not divide equally. The cold that comes from the outside. The nest was built well. That much is worth saying clearly. The mother spent a full day constructing it, digging the shallow hollow, lining it first with dry grass and plant material, then with fur she pulled from her own chest and belly, leaving a bare patch on her skin that would take weeks to grow back. The fur lining of a rabbit nest is one of the most effective pieces of natural insulation you will find at that scale. It is dense, soft, and designed to trap body heat with extraordinary efficiency. A nest like this, in the right conditions, can maintain a temperature several degrees warmer than the surrounding air for hours after the last kit has settled. The key phrase is "in the right conditions." A closed nest, with all 5 kits pressed together in a tight pile at the center, is a different thermal system from a nest where the smallest kit has been displaced to the outer edge. The huddle is the mechanism. 5 bodies generating heat together, insulated by fur on all sides, lose warmth at a rate that 5 bodies can sustain through the night. One body at the margin of the huddle, partially outside the fur lining, exposed to the air that moves through the burrow entrance, is a different calculation entirely. The smallest kit is not fully outside the nest. It is not fully inside it either. It occupies the threshold, which is the most dangerous place in any shelter. On the 3rd night after the litter was born, the temperature dropped. Not dramatically, not to the extremes of deep winter, but to the kind of cold that early spring produces in the hours before dawn, when the ground has given up its stored warmth and the sky is clear, and the dew turns to frost on the grass above the burrow entrance. Inside the nest, the 4 larger kits maintained their core temperature within a manageable range. Their combined body heat and the insulation of the fur lining was enough to carry them through. The smallest kit shivered for 2 hours before the mother returned for the pre-dawn feeding. Shivering is a metabolic response, the body burning calories it cannot afford to burn in order to generate the heat it is not getting from the huddle. A kit that shives through the night arrives at the morning feeding already behind. It has spent reserves it needed to grow. It nurses urgently, and it gets what it gets, which is less than the larger ones took before it, and it settles back into the nest slightly weaker than it was the night before. The gap widens. Slowly, by fractions, but in one direction only. This is the mechanism. Not a dramatic event, not a single night that decides everything, just the accumulated weight of slightly less warmth and slightly less milk and slightly more exposure, night after night, compounding quietly in the dark while the mother forages and the larger kits sleep, and the smallest one burns through what little margin it has just to make it to morning. The entrance. By the 5th day, the smallest kit had been pushed to the entrance of the burrow. Not dramatically, not in a single shove. The way it happened was quieter than that, and, in some ways, harder to watch because of how ordinary it looked. The 4 larger kits, growing faster now, needed more space. They moved and shifted and pressed in the way that kits do, driven by the same blind physics of warmth and contact that governs all newborn mammals. The smallest kit, unable to match the pressure of 4 bodies that outweighed it, ended up where the space was available, which was at the edge, which was near the entrance, which was the place in the nest where the outside world began. The entrance of a rabbit burrow is a threshold in more than one sense. It is where the temperature of the nest meets the temperature of the air. It is where the scent of the nest, which builds up over days into a specific signature that the mother can read instantly, becomes diluted by the moving air of the field or garden above, and it is the first place a predator's nose encounters when it comes close enough to the burrow to be a serious threat. A kit near the entrance is more exposed in every direction that matters. Thermally exposed, because the insulation is thinner there, and the cold air moves across it more directly. Olfactorily exposed, because its scent travels out into the air above more readily than the scent of the kits buried deeper in the fur-lined center. And physically exposed in the most direct sense, because it is closer to the opening. Less earth between it and whatever is moving through the yard at night. The smallest kit did not know any of this. It knew warmth and the absence of warmth. It knew the pressure of bodies against its own and the absence of that pressure. It knew hunger in the way that newborns know hunger, as a total and consuming state, and it knew the relief of the mother's return and the urgency with which it had to nurse before the larger ones took what was available. It did not know about the crow in the hedge 3 yards away that had been watching the burrow entrance since yesterday morning. It did not know about the cat that crossed the yard at 10 the previous night and paused at the garden bed for 30 seconds before moving on. It only knew that it was cold, and that the warmth it needed was always just a little further away than it could reach. What biology asks of the smallest one. Here is the part that most people do not know, and it is the part that changes everything about how you look at a runt once you understand it. The smallest kit is not simply receiving less, it is working harder. Its body, operating on thinner reserves, is running its metabolic systems at a higher cost relative to what it has available. Where the larger kits can afford to sleep deeply through a cold hour, the smallest one cannot. Its shivering is involuntary, an emergency response to a temperature drop that the others are not feeling because they are insulated by the pile of warm bodies above and around them. Each shiver costs calories. Each calorie spent on shivering is a calorie not spent on growth. And yet, something happens in some of the smallest kits that does not happen in the larger ones. A response that biologists have documented in runts across multiple mammal species, and that remains not entirely understood. The smallest individuals sometimes show an elevated drive to nurse. Not just urgency, which all kits display, but something closer to sustained effort. A willingness to fight for position at the milk supply that is disproportionate to their size. A smaller body pressing through a gap between larger ones with a persistence that the larger ones do not exhibit because they do not need to. They get there first. They do not have to try as hard. Whether this is the body compensating for its own deficit, whether it is something in the hormonal response to chronic hunger, whether it is simply the outcome of a kit that has been forced by circumstance to develop a specific kind of relentlessness, the researchers are still working through. What is documented is the behavior itself. The smallest kit in many litters is not the most passive. It is, in certain observable ways, the most determined. On the 6th day, the smallest kit nursed last again. It always nursed last. But on this morning it held its position at the milk supply for longer than usual, past the point where the larger kits had moved away, past the point where the mother would normally have ended the feeding. And in those additional seconds, it received something it had not received in the previous 5 mornings. Not enough to close the gap, but enough to matter, enough to put a fraction of weight back on the bones that the cold nights had taken, enough to carry it one more day toward the point where its eyes would open and the world would become something more than warmth and the absence of warmth. It was not winning, it was not thriving, but it was still there, and for an animal in its position, still there is not nothing. Still there is, in fact, everything. The night the crow came closer. On the seventh night, two things happened. One of them, the smallest kit, survived. The other it did not know had happened at all, and that unknowing may have been the only thing that kept it still. The first thing was the crow. Crows are not predators of rabbit kits in the direct sense that a hawk or a fox is a predator, but they are opportunists of exceptional intelligence, and they monitor the world around them with a precision that most people underestimate. The crow that had been watching the burrow entrance from the hedge since the fourth day had been tracking a change. Not the burrow itself, which it had passed without pausing for the first 3 days, but the entrance. The way the grass mat covering the opening had shifted slightly. The faint movement it had detected on 2 consecutive mornings at the same hour. A small shape at the edge of the entrance that was there and then was not. Crows do not act on incomplete information. They gather. They watch. They wait until the picture resolves into something they can act on. On the seventh night, the crow moved from the hedge to the garden bed, 6 feet from the burrow entrance, and it stood there in the dark for 4 minutes. The smallest kit, at the outer edge of the nest, was the kit closest to the entrance. It was the kit the crow was closest to. The crow left without acting. Something in the calculation did not close. Perhaps the grass mat still covered enough of the entrance that the confirmation it needed was not there. Perhaps the sound of a dog in a neighboring yard shifted its attention. Whatever the reason, it moved back to the hedge and did not return that night. The smallest kit did not move. It did not know what had stood 6 feet away. Its body was too occupied with the cold and the slow work of staying warm to register the vibration of a crow on soft garden soil. The second thing that happened was the temperature. The pre-dawn hour on the 8th night was the coldest since the litter was born. The frost was heavy. The grass above the burrow was white with it, and the smallest kit, at the entrance edge of the nest, shivered for 3 hours. Not intermittently, continuously. 3 hours of the body burning everything it had in order to maintain the minimum temperature required to keep the organs running. When the mother arrived at the pre-dawn feeding, the smallest kit was the last to respond, slower than usual, moving with the particular heaviness of an animal that has spent the night at its own limits. But it responded. It nursed. It held on. And when the feeding was over and the mother left and the yard went quiet again, it was still in the nest, still at the entrance edge, still cold, still small. Still alive. What this has to do with your yard. I want to step back from the nest for a moment and tell you something about why this particular story matters beyond the specific fate of one small rabbit in one burrow in one yard. Most people who find a nest, who look into that shallow hollow and count the small shapes inside, will count 5 and feel relief at the number. 5 feels like abundance. 5 feels like a litter that is going to be fine. What most people do not think to check is whether all 5 are the same size, whether the one at the edge is the same weight as the one at the center, whether the grass mat has been disturbed not by the mother returning, but by one small kit that cannot quite push itself back inside. Knowing what you now know changes what you see when you look at a nest. The kit nearest the entrance is not there by accident. It is there because the dynamics of the huddle placed it there. It is the one that needs the grass mat replaced most carefully over the opening. It is the one that benefits most from a yard that has dense cover nearby, that has leaf litter and brush that keeps the ground temperature above the surrounding air by even 1 or 2 degrees. It is the one for whom the small decisions you make about your outdoor space, whether to leave the hedge untrimmed, whether to let the garden bed run a little wild at the edges, whether to resist the impulse to investigate too often and too closely, matter most directly. The nest does not ask for much. What it asks for is exactly what a manicured yard withholds: a little mess, a little cover, a little of the strategic untidiness that looks like neglect from the outside and functions like shelter from the inside. The smallest kit in any litter is the one most dependent on the environment being slightly less hostile than the worst-case scenario. It has no margin to spare for additional cold. It has no reserve to burn on additional exposure. The yard it was born into is not background. It is the variable that tips the balance. And here is the thing that I find most difficult to say cleanly, but that I think is true. The smallest bunny was not expected to survive. Not in the sense that anyone decided this, not in the sense that the mother chose it, but in the statistical sense, in the biological sense. Litters produce runts, and runts have lower survival rates, and the math of this is known and documented and consistent across the species. The smallest kit is the one the numbers are against. It is the one the cold is against. It is the one whose position in the nest is against it. And it is still there. The one the numbers were against. I want to end with the 10th day. Because on the 10th day, something happened that I want you to hold on to. The smallest kit opened its eyes. Not first. The 2 largest kits opened theirs on the 9th day, which is within the normal range for cottontail development. The 3 middle kits opened theirs across the 9th and 10th days, and the smallest one, running behind on the developmental timeline, the way it had run behind on everything else, opened its eyes on the morning of the 10th day, in the pre-dawn hour just after the mother had visited, in the particular gray light that filters into a shallow burrow when the sun is still below the horizon, but the sky has begun to lighten. It had never seen anything before. The world it had inhabited for 10 days had been a world of pressure and warmth and hunger and cold, of vibration and the smell of fur and earth and the particular scent of the mother that meant relief was coming. And then, in the space of a few seconds, it became something else. It became a world with dimension, with the circle of the entrance at the end of the tunnel, with the pale light coming through, with the shapes of its siblings, larger than itself, settled in the pile behind it. I do not know what a rabbit kit experiences in the moment its eyes open. I do not think anyone does, not really. But I know what I find myself thinking when I sit with this story. I think about what it means to have been in the dark for 10 days, working constantly against a deficit you did not choose and cannot name, and to have made it to the morning when the light arrives. Not because the numbers said you would, not because the biology guaranteed it, but because you did not stop. Because the cold was real, and the hunger was real, and the position you were born into was real, and you were still there anyway. The smallest bunny was left behind in every way that phrase can mean. Left at the edge of the nest, left nearest the entrance, left closest to the cold and the predators and the hard variables that a burrow exists to hold at bay. And it was still there on the 10th morning when the light came in. I think that is worth something. I think it is worth more than most of the things I will encounter today. And I suspect you do too, which is why this story landed the way it did, if it landed at all. Tell me in the comments, have you ever watched something survive that you did not expect to survive? A nest in your yard? An animal you thought was not going to make it? A moment where the numbers were wrong? I want to hear it. Every version of this story matters, and this community holds all of them. If this reached you in a way you did not expect, share it with someone who would feel it. Sometimes the smallest thing is the one that carries the most weight. I will see you in the next one.